Thank you, Mr. President. I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm here again today to talk about my concerns that are emerging and the problems that we're seeing in Venezuela. Last May 25th, just a couple weeks ago, I wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, that was signed by 11 of my colleagues. Senator Ensign from Nevada and I wrote this letter together, and we're welcome to have 10 other senators join in a letter to Secretary Clinton to speak about our concern. In fact, what we would call a gathering storm of concern about the country of Venezuela. The letter sought, Mr. President, to have a review by the Secretary of State and the Department of State as to whether or not Venezuela should be added to this list of states that we consider state sponsors of terror. The letter went through a number of issues that I have spoken about on the floor before concerning some very questionable behavior by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. One of the issues that it talked about was the support of Venezuela for the narco-terrorists in Colombia, the FARC. Evidence has come forward that Venezuela's weapons have found their way into the hands of these narco-terrorists. Another of the things that we talked about in the letter was the concern with a plot that was revealed by a Spanish judge in March of this past year, a plot to assassinate President Uribe in Colombia, where the Spanish judge has accused Venezuela of being behind that plot, along with a Spanish terrorist group called the ETA. The letter also spoke about Hezbollah's activities in Venezuela. Hezbollah, the Middle Eastern terrorist group supported by Iran. The letter also spoke of the troubling new information that for at least 3 years, Venezuela and Iran have been putting factories together in Venezuela, in remote areas of eastern Venezuela, which is the area believed to be rich in uranium. December of 2008, Turkish customs authorities caught one of these joint companies, literally called VEN Iran, the VEN for Venezuela, a tractor factory, attempting to smuggle 22 containers of explosive materials labeled as tractor parts. Since 2007, we pointed out there have been direct flights between Caracas, Venezuela, and Tehran, Iran, without proper control or customs verifications. We've also pointed out in the letter that there are increasing paramilitary Iranian forces operating in Venezuela. Now, we know from recent reports from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, that Iran now looks to have the nuclear fuel which will give them the capability to build nuclear weapons. We've had open testimony in front of the Armed Services Committee that within 3 to 5 years, Iran may have the intercontinental ballistic capability to deliver those weapons across the ocean and put the United States in jeopardy. But, Mr. President, Venezuela is a lot closer. There's no need for an ICBM from Venezuela. In fact, the flight from Venezuela to Florida is about the same length and time as the flight from Florida to Washington, D.C. So, Mr. President, we brought this letter to the attention of Secretary Clinton in May. We wrote this letter May 25th, 2010. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that this letter be added to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And we hope to receive a response from the Department of State. I know firsthand that Secretary Clinton is focused on Latin America. I've spoken to her on several occasions. I know that she knows that we need to do a better job promoting democracy in Latin America. She shares that concern. We've had those conversations. For too long, Latin America has been neglected by the United States in our diplomatic relations. For a variety of reasons, some of them with good merit, we've been focusing to the east. But we cannot neglect our friends in Central and South America. We cannot neglect our friends in Colombia, for example, or in Panama. That's why I've come to the floor on several occasions and called for the ratification of the free trade agreements between our country and those countries. It only makes sense. It only makes sense for jobs and commerce, but it also makes sense in terms of our good relations with our friends in the region. No better friend do we have than in Colombia, right next door to this very concerning state of Venezuela. The reason I come to the floor specifically today, Mr. President, is that when we sent this letter on May 25th, we expected to receive a response. Yet, just last Friday, Assistant Secretary Arturo Valenzuela, Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, was asked about this letter because there's an upcoming trip by the Secretary of State to South America. Secretary Valenzuela was asked why Secretary Clinton was not going to Venezuela, and he explained, and then the question of this letter came up, and his response was, "Oh, I don't know because I was traveling. I don't know anything about this letter, so I'll have to find out." Now, I know that they get a lot of letters over at the Department of State, but this letter is signed by 11 senators. It's been widely covered in the media. It was relevant enough that someone would ask the question at a press conference, yet Mr. Valenzuela, through some oversight, was unaware of the letter. I look forward to getting the response from Secretary Clinton and Assistant Secretary Valenzuela to this letter. There is a gathering storm in Venezuela. And as much as we have to look across the ocean to our fears about Iran, their development of nuclear weapons, and what they're going to do with those nuclear weapons, there is a concern to our south, very close to our shores in Venezuela, and a dangerous combination which is occurring between Iran and Venezuela, Ahmadinejad and Hugo Chavez. And if we don't stay focused on it, mark my words, 3-5 years from now, we're going to be seeing all the same developments in Venezuela that we've seen in Iran. We're going to see them starting to develop, a nuclear presence for peaceful purposes. And they're going to be playing the same playbook that Ahmadinejad has played in Iran. Now, we've got to take aggressive measures against Iran, and I have called, as many of senators have, for this administration to get to work in a more expeditious way to impose those sanctions, meaningful, hard sanctions on Iran to stop their nuclear program. We're reading in the newspaper today about Iran, all the circuitous efforts it takes to reflag ships, rename ships, so they can get weapons back into Iran and avoid our sanctions. We've got to crack down on that. And that is the diplomatic and foreign affairs problem of today. But the diplomatic and foreign affairs problem of tomorrow is Venezuela. And steps should be taken right now to work ahead of that problem so that 3 and 5 years from now, we're not having all the same troubles with Venezuela that we're now having with Iran, yet a far closer to the United States than Iran is. So we sent this letter, and we look forward to the response. There are a lot of ramifications of declaring a country a state sponsor of terror. And I'm not asking that that be done today, but I'm asking that it be seriously evaluated. That's why Senator Ensign and myself, along with 10 other of our colleagues, sent this letter. And we'd like to hear a response. We'd like it to be taken seriously. We'd like this administration to focus on Venezuela before it's a problem that gets ahead of us, before it's a problem that we don't have enough time to address in a proactive and thoughtful manner. Little problems become big problems. This problem is already beyond the fact of being little. But let's get on top of it, let's evaluate it, and we hope we get a response to this letter as soon as possible from the Secretary of State and the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka.